here? Well, okay. Well, we talked about some of this stuff before. I mean, some of it off and on. So it's not totally, we're not, shouldn't be totally oblivious to some of the things I'm talking about tonight, but there's always good, there's always a lot to say about this topic. And I doubt many of you certainly remember all the stuff we've talked about. And of course, I always add some new information in there that I find out or something. So it can't hurt. But design arguments have always been one of my favorite things in discussing, the evidence for God in the world. I think through the world of design has always been very powerful and very interesting, very edifying personally. Um, so I've always liked design arguments, just looking at them, analyzing them, reading about them, studying them, looking at objections and looking at the pros and cons. I use a lot of these points on college campuses, these design arguments. I use them a lot when I talk to people, or some of them, I should say, when if it's needed. Obviously, design arguments don't save anybody. They're just like a starting point to get people on the right track towards the gospel. The gospel is obviously what saves somebody, but sometimes you need to get people moving in that direction. They need a first step. So that's what we kind of do with this. Especially you're dealing with agnostics or atheists, of course. So the design arguments start with the understanding that God wants to communicate with humans. And just as we have human relationships and they get formed through communication, God wants to do the same thing. So we obviously form a lot of relationships through talking, emailing, texting, and hanging out with each other and, you know, using technology, all kinds of ways to communicate now. But when it comes to God, God is a different kind of being, of course, and he has to, of course, he's the one that gets to pick the medium to communicate with us. We don't get to tell him, you better show yourself real through this way or that way. I'm not going to believe. And, it doesn't quite work like that. God's the one who gets to decide how he wants to communicate. So, generally in life, there are five kinds of communication. There's, of course, verbal communication. We just talked about there's nonverbal communication, body language, tone. When someone says your body language, you say one thing, but your body language says another thing, right? If you're married, the body language is very important. And then in written communication, of course, we have emails, texting, things like that. Listening is a form of communication. And then there's visual communication. That's where we use imagery or symbols, or we might draw something. If you guys have ever been to a museum, which I'm sure you have, you go look at paintings all day long or art, sculpture, whatever it is, and you see the communication of the artist, right? You didn't see the artist do it. You don't know the artist personally, most likely, but you look at the imagery they use and the symbols they use and the drawing they use to communicate what they're trying to say. Or it could just be through a sculpture or something, right? So that's called visual communication, of course. Now, this sounds very basic, but when it comes to design arguments, we're really talking about a form of God's visual communication to us, right? Visual, meaning that he's made something and then we can observe it and we can see his design in it. We can see if there's a designer behind the design, right? And so we don't see God directly, as I've said. God's not the same as a table or a car or anything in your room right now. He's not made by anything else. He doesn't have parts. He doesn't have measurements. He, doesn't have composition. He wasn't, you can't really put him in the same category as all these things that are made around us, things that have physicality to them and you can quantify them. And of course, they were put together by somebody else, right? Put together by an architect or a builder or whatever. God's not in that category. So what he does is he communicates through the things he's made. right, through the design of the world. And there's been more than enough written on this over the years, the design arguments. There's been a movement called intelligent design that came out a few decades ago, 3 or 4 decades ago, and the guys that started this movement were kind of responding to some of the more evidence that came in science. Actually, it started with the evidence that started coming out in the sciences, that it just seemed that there was a lot more evidence that came into pointed design. Guys like William Dembski here, who's a mathematician and a philosopher, and then some other people, as I'll talk about in a minute, they thought it was time to revive the design arguments and really give them a robust um, turn up, and also to present them to the public. The design arguments are always there, but there was so much coming out in cosmology and biology and chemistry and things. They just said, wow, this is the time to really, we need to put this stuff out there in the public to let them look at it, right? um, and if you want to get a good introduction, that's a good book, introducing or understanding intelligent design in plain language, by William Dembski and Sean McDowell. um, Dembski has written a lot of books. He's one of the chief architects of the intelligent design movement. You can find any of his books online. And there's a lot of other contributors to this debate. Now, when the intelligent design movement came out and started getting more and more recognized, the scientific community pushed back big time against it, because of course, they'd always had their paradigm with a Darwinian evolutionary model. And so they were not happy that intelligent design scholars were writing about alternatives to a naturalistic evolutionary scenario, and they were pointing out the evidence of design nature. So there was a lot of pushback, still is to this day, and it kind of challenged the existing paradigms that are out there, and people don't like their paradigms being challenged. So that's always been the case. There's a guy a long time ago, when I was a new believer in the mid 90s, named Michael Behe, and he's a biologist. I forget, one of the schools, maybe a school in Pennsylvania somewhere, but yeah, Pennsylvania. But I don't know if he's still there. Maybe he retired. But he wrote this book called Darwin's Black Box, and when that came out, that just caused an uproar. And so he um, he really challenged some things in the modern evolutionary paradigm, and he got a lot of pushback. He ended up writing a book about 3 years ago, after 25 years of hearing criticisms. He wrote a book responding to his critics. But he certainly caused an uproar in the scientific community. I'll talk more about what he actually said later on, what his argument was. But then you had and then William Dembski, the guy that one of the chief architects of the intelligent design movement, came out the second edition of the book called The Design Inference. And in that model, he really has like a mathematical model and scientific model to detect design in nature. Um, so that came out just, I think, about 3 or 4 months ago, his updated version of that. You do need to know some math to understand it, but it's still, kind of interesting. I'm not an expert mathematician either, but still, we see the updated version there. And then we have a guy named Dr. Stephen Meyer. He went to Cambridge, and he's written a slew of books on intelligent design. His latest book that came out a couple years ago is called The Return of the God Hypothesis. And that dealt with the three scientific discoveries: the beginning of the universe, the design of the universe, and the design of your what's called the information argument, which talks about your DNA and how the information inside that DNA that tells the cells what to do, the instructions that are there. It's a written code, and he talks about that in that book. And then he talked about the Cambrian explosion, um, and Darwin's doubt, and signature in the cell. So he's got a lot of books out too. You can read them. He's been, of course, gotten some criticisms, and he's written responses to them. So he's been around for a while too. You can look up some of his stuff. So when we're talking about design, or might say like intelligent design, what we're saying is that when you look at something in the world, like an object or an event, we're saying that that can't be the result of unguided natural processes. Okay, we can't say that can be the result of a completely non-intelligent answer. Or we might say it can't be the result of chance or coincidence. Okay, so what design arguments have always said is that there has to be a intelligent agent behind what we see. So it has to be coming from a mind that plans ahead and thinks ahead with an end goal in mind, just like humans. We plan our lives, plan way ahead, foresight, foreknowledge, right? So that's basically kind of some of the points behind it. And so what we do is we observe God's effects in the world around us, because God's effects are everywhere, right? We observe his effects. We don't observe him directly. You don't see God directly, just like I don't see anybody, just not the same way we see human directly. God's a different kind of being. So we don't see God directly, because that's probably a good thing. He's way too holy and way too all consuming for us to observe him directly. So he reveals himself through his effects. Of course, Jesus is an effect of God, and Jesus, of course, is the primary way we come to know God. But he also reveals himself through many things in the natural world. Okay. And so when we think about intelligence, intelligence is a goal-directed process, right? That's capable of thinking with will, forethought, and intentionality, right? To achieve a goal. You guys are all intelligent agents on this call. All of you have goals. All of you have used forethought, and you've used intentionality to bring something to pass, you with an end goal. So that's just part of humans who we are. And it's not that hard to see God doing the same thing when you observe the effects in the world around us. Okay, there's effects that look like there was forethought and intentionality, and it looks like some sort of end goal in mind. So that's what the teleological argument is. We call it it's technically called the teleological argument, and it looks at the idea of order and purpose in an event and object, right? And then we talk about how that's God. So your life itself is seen as a larger part, a larger teleological goal, right? You guys all have said to yourself at one point, what is the aim, purpose, or end goal of my life? I mean, people are trying to figure that out all over the place today, right? Is the teleological goal in your life, is the end goal that you just live the American dream, you go to college, have a family, make money, retire, and die? That's pretty much the typical American dream scenario. If you don't participate in that, you're a weirdo. Or is there something larger than that God has given us? God has created us for a purpose, and that purpose is to know him and make himself known. So that is our ultimate teleological goal. Okay, that's the end goal of our life, is to know God and make him known. Okay, so yeah, we can have little goals inside of that, like I want to build a shack in my backyard, or I want to achieve something in win a 10K marathon, or in some cases a 2K marathon like me, or I want to travel to Australia, or I want to do this or that. We have little goals, but the overall goal of our lives as believers is to know God and to make him known. So what you do with intelligent design or design arguments is you look at the effects in the world, and of course we look at cause and effect relationships. We look at effects and we say, what's the cause behind that effect we observe? We do that all the time, all day long. I mean, we know that we see effects all around us, and we sometimes say, well, how'd that happen? Or I wonder how that got there. Or, wow, I wonder, just like you're driving down the freeway and you see a bad accident in an ambulance, you might see there's the effect. What caused that? Did the person collide with a semi, or did he run off the side of the road by accident? Did he rear end somebody? Whatever. We observe cause and effect things all day long. Okay, now just like when you're walking along a sand dune, or like along the beach, and you see this giant carved out sand castle of Jesus. Look at the rib cage he has there, how good that is, his abs. Someone really did a good job on his abs. But I don't think anybody would say that just the wind and the erosion and time and the water just made that sandcastle of Jesus like that. You would know every single time you'd see something like that, you know it was caused by an intelligent mind. No matter whether it's 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20,000 years ago, or 5,000 years ago, whatever, you know that that was caused by an intelligent mind. Just like when you look at a wind dune over here, I mean, it's beautiful, but you would probably say that's just the natural world operating. I mean, it's pretty evident now God certainly uses the natural world for his purposes. He created the natural world, but you can see the very specific complexity of that sandcastle, right? It's very specified and it's complex, right? So that's what we use in intelligence. We use that language of like specified complexity. You can see it there. And then same thing with Mount Rushmore. You know, whenever you've seen these four heads, I don't think anybody would say, well, the rock and the time and wind and, you know, just the course of history eventually just carved out these four faces on Mount Rushmore. You would never say that. You'd say that is a result of an intelligent agent, and that intelligent agent had intentionality and foresight. And, you know, there was a goal there. The goal was to make those four faces there, right? So, you know, that always comes from an intelligent mind. Okay. And sometimes we make design inferences in archaeology. We see that you know, we observe, like we find something from hundreds or thousands of years ago, and we see a inscription on it or something. We know that, you know, that was carved out or made by an intelligent mind. So we use design inferences in archaeology all the time. Of course we do, because archaeology is always finding things like this. We know that the sand and the erosion or whatever, wherever it was found in the ground, the course of time would not be able to carve out or sand, or, you know, or dirt or whatever, rain, or all the influences of nature would still probably not going to be able to make an inscription such as that. You know that it comes from a mind every time. And just like, you know, we use design inferences in criminology. You know, criminal investigators, when they find someone dead, they find someone, you know, crime scene, or let's say you take like a man that fell here, they have to rule out possibilities or rule out different explanations. You know, did he fall by accident? Was it by chance? Was he pushed intentionally by somebody? You know, was it necessity he had to fall? They use design inferences and criminology and criminal investigations all the time. They're trying to see if an intelligent or a mind or somebody else was involved in what they're finding. Did it happen just accidentally or naturalistically? So design inferences are used in criminal investigations as well. And we know that just common sense that just about everything you observe in reality is designed. Just about every little. Wait a minute. Can everybody hear me? I hope by now I'm just not finding out nobody's hearing me, because you guys should have put that in the chat room. Is everybody hearing me, or is it just Larry?
You're good.
I need someone to write in the chat room right now.
We can hear you.
Okay, Larry, sorry, everyone can hear me.
No,
I
you're
hear
good.
you.
I can hear
Larry,
you.
I do.
you can't hear me? I don't know. Maybe it's your mute or something, but everyone else can hear me.
Yeah.
No, we lost you for a second. That's why I was sending you a message when you came
okay.
back.
Okay. I was worried there. I was like, I assume you guys would have told me if you could hear me by now. All right. No problem. Thank you, Larry. Just text me if it happens again long term. I got my phone right here. Thank you. Okay. Where were we here? I'm sorry. So there's no doubt that just about everything around us is designed. I mean, we know that looking at your phone or anything around you doesn't come from the result of a blind, unguided, naturalistic process, right? Just about everything, mostly around you. In your room, just look in your room. Books. Hey, I've got a stack of books that came from a mind. I've got a computer that came from a mind. I've got my phone that came from a mind. I've got a bed in my room that came from a mind. I've got this in my room. Everything, right? So intelligent design is all around us, of course, just in human intelligence. I'm talking about the humans, you know, being intelligent agents for sure. Now, a design, can look like sometimes look like a pattern caused by natural forces, right? And God can use that. Obviously, if you look at the ripples on a sandy beach, it's pretty cool. And that is caused by natural forces. But since God created the natural world, he can set it up where that will happen, right? So that can be a form of design as well. Now, there's a guy that wrote a book, I think about 10 years ago, called Undeniable. And this is by Douglas Axe. He's a biologist. I forget what kind of biologist, but he's brilliant, like they all are. And wrote that uh, he wrote this book called How Biology Confirms Our Intuition That Life is Design. And basically, what he says is that most children at a very early age really are able to look around the world and attribute it to a godlike designer. It's just an intuitive sense that they have. It's very early on that we have this in life. Even if, let's say you're raised in an atheist country like Russia or somewhere where they teach you don't have a soul, and or some other communist regime, like China or something, and say, but still, for children will see that very early on. The parent has to try to like talk them out of it, to try to tell them that no, 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 there's no God. And that those things just happen through chance and time. But it seems to be, evidently speaking, from a very early age that children are able to detect some kind of designer, some kind of intelligence. And what he says in that book, Douglas Axe, he says, he calls it common science, that everyone seems to validate their design intuition through firsthand experience. And this experience is scientific in nature because we all make mental notes of what we observed and build conceptual models of how things work. Now, I know for me, from a very early age, I always believed in design. I didn't have a problem believing in a God, and I wasn't a believer yet. I wasn't a full-blown Christian because I hadn't heard the gospel yet. But from a very early age, I always believed in some sort of designer, and really just because from being out in the world of nature and just I like walking around in the neighborhood I was in. I like doing things in nature. I loved insects. I liked exploring nature. I catch insects and let them go. I'd take walks. Whatever. Anyway, I was kind of a nature guy. And I just knew there had to be a God. There had to be a designer just by being out in nature. I could, it was intuitive to me. And so this psychologist here at UC Berkeley, even though she's an atheist, she even says by elementary age, children start to invoke ultimate godlike designer to explain the complexity of the world around them, even children brought up by atheists. So there's another professor who says this right here. I don't quite have her name on the slide. I'm sorry. But I think she teaches at Berkeley. Oh, no, it's down the bottom. I'm sorry. If you could see it. But she, let me see. Let me see if I can get this. There we go. Okay. Let me move my bar out of the, oh yeah, Deborah Kellerman. Sorry. My apologies. Let me move that up a little bit. Right there. I fixed it. There. Sorry, I'm allowed to do that. I'm going to fix that right there too, right on the spot. Isn't that cool? It's amazing how you can do that. So she says here, humans do have strong predispositions to construct beliefs about purpose and function, nature, but it's physical, social, and culture environments that bring them out. Even though advanced scientific training can reduce acceptance of scientifically inaccurate teleological explanations, it cannot erase a tenacious, early emerging human tendency to find purpose in nature. It seems that our minds may be naturally more geared to religion than science. I would disagree with her in one way. I would agree that we are naturally inclined to that because God has constructed the world that way. That's why we have such a tendency to see design in nature. Is because God has constructed the world that way and constructed us. But I don't agree that scientific training can necessarily get rid of it because I think that the evidence in science is pointing more to design than it used to. So, but she has her own presuppositions and bias, of course. So anyway, And I've talked about this, when you go on a campus like we're at Via High State University, and the other college we go to here in Columbus, Ohio, we do, campus evangelism apologetics, that, we use the question, does God exist? That's one of our favorite questions. And he, when we put this question up for students to answer, you notice they can say yes, no, or I don't know. You see a lot of yeses. And the number one reason they say yes is creation. They say there's just no way that we got here through chance or an accident. They just don't accept it. And that's a good thing, because you think on a college campus, everyone would be an atheist. That's not true. I mean, we have some knows there and don't know. But I would say that there are a lot of people that have the intuitive sense that there is a creator. Okay. It's very obvious to a lot of people. Okay. And that's why Paul says in Romans 1, he makes it clear. He says, the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. But we can be known about them as plain to them because God has shown it to them, for his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world, and things have been made, so they are without excuse. So, it says that God has made it known to us. It's plain, it's clear. And we can perceive his existence through what has been made. Like I talked about, the things that he's made, we observe as effects, right? And when we look at his effects, we should be able to know God is powerful. There's a powerful creator. He's personal. Can't be an impersonal being like the higher power God. And because he made things, that involves intelligence, involves planning, right? And he's, of course, a moral being as well. So Paul wrote about this a long time ago, and we see the evidence for it in the world around us. Most people perceive some kind of creator. Now, if you have a non-God view, that God is not involved with it, then this would be what you'd have to say. And it's kind of depressing, but it's just, this is what your alternative is. You'd have to say the universe was produced by a mindless, non-conscious, non-moral process. The humans came to be by an undirected, valueless process, and that life somehow emerged from non-living matter, and all the cosmic constants just happened to be right, and we got the right universe. A perfect universe to have life on Earth just popped out of nowhere, and it just happened to be set up precisely for life. So it just happened all by chance. No mind behind it. We just got lucky. Okay, that's of course the view that God's not involved. It's called a naturalistic view. Everything's explained by a naturalistic explanation, not an intelligent explanation. I mean, look at Francis Crick. He was one of the famous guys behind the DNA code, a molecular biologist. He said biologists must constantly keep in mind that what they see was not designed, but rather evolved. I mean, he's basically conceding that most biologists will see things that look like they were designed, but they can't attribute them to being designed. It's like you have to suppress it, right? And then you had Richard Dawkins, one of those famous atheists in the last 40 years, when he wrote his book, The Blind Watchmaker. He said, biology is a study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. So everything looks like outwardly it's designed for a purpose, but it's only when you cut underneath it all, it's really not. It's not really designed by anyone, and it's just looks like it's been designed, but it's not really designed, and there's no designer. That's why he calls his book The Blind Watchmaker. They'll talk about, he's wrong, of course, but it's funny he said that. So, when it comes to evolution, it's kind of interesting, because if you look at the academic world and all the different majors your kids take, and I deal with a lot of psychology majors on the campuses I'm on. A lot of people are majoring in psychology these days. But whatever you major in, I mean, whatever field you're in, whether it be religious studies or sociology or psychology or social work or history or, of course, the sciences, but evolution is no longer an explanation about biological change. That's what it used to be. Now it's an entire worldview. Evolution can explain economics, it can explain religion, it can explain psychology. There's evolutionary psychology, there's evolutionary um, influence in history and the humanities and everything. It's just become a whole entire worldview, way more than it used to be. And when you talk about defining evolution, it's really important that whenever someone says to you, do you believe in evolution? You always need to ask them, what do you mean by evolution? Because there isn't really one definition. You've got some of these definitions here, and they're really not number one and two, as far as change over time, history of nature, any sequence of events in nature. That's not really a controversial issue, excuse me, nor is number two. That's not really a controversial issue. The problem you get into is number three, where they would say that natural selection acting on random mutations is it complains the or explains the complexity of life and the design of everything without any guidance. It just happened. Those are the two mechanisms. And then number four, universal common descent, that we all descended from a single common ancestor, and that's contested as well. But when you take the Richard Dawkins thesis that he wrote in his book, The Blind Watchmaker, basically he said that his view is that the idea that all organisms that descended from common ancestors, solely unguided, solely through an unguided, unintelligent, purposeless material process such as natural selection, acting on random mutations or mutations, variations or random mutations, that the mechanisms of natural selection, random variation, mutation, and perhaps other similarly naturalistic mechanisms are completely sufficient to account for the appearance of designed living organisms. So that book has been certainly critiqued over and over as not being correct. But that's a very, very the opposite of intelligent design, of course, just as blind watchmaker hypothesis. And that is something that, we can't agree with that definition of evolution. That's just something that we can't go along with. There's actually a book written in response to him called How Blind is the Watchmaker? So they critique Dawkins' book in that book. And of course, there's some real problems with Dawkins' book. So when it comes to evolution these days, it's kind of interesting is that there's been a lot of books or some criticisms of the modern evolutionary synthesis, meaning that whenever you went to college, I don't know, some of you here, what you learned, or how many years ago you went to college, or what your academic background is. But most high schools and colleges kind of use a standard evolutionary paradigm, and it's been kind of challenged by some of these books right here. And these guys are all atheists that are writing they're not even Christians that write these books. This book here came out not too long ago by two cognitive scientists. They're both atheists. But they say in their book, What Darwin Got Wrong, they say, in fact, they're convinced that Darwin's theory of natural selection is irredeemably flawed. They say, in fact, we don't know very well how evolution works, nor did Darwin, nor as far as we can tell, does anyone else. No straightforward single level theory similar to Newton's law of gravity is going to be able to explain what is observed in natural history. Rather, they contend a multi-level explanation is necessary. Multi-level explanations are like historical theories, which try to explain why Napoleon did what he did at Waterloo. Therefore, simplistic theories such as natural selection cannot be an adequate solution. So they're both atheists, and they're pretty staunch atheists, but they say we just do not have a good working definition of what even evolution is in some ways, and they don't agree natural selection is evolution. So that was a pretty strong criticism of the modern synthesis that's not too long ago. And then this gentleman here, James Shapiro, he wrote a book called Evolution: A View from the 21st Century. He's not a Christian either. He's a biologist, and he said here he rejects the foundational neo-Darwinian tenet that evolutionary change comes about by scholastic mutations as a determination. In the 19th-20th centuries, biologists reject the role of a supernatural agent in the religious accounts of how diverse living organisms originated. He says living cells do not operate blindly. He says they continue to acquire information, make a judgment, self-regulate, and self-correct. Wow. Sounds like a mind behind that. As to the actual nature of evolutionary change processes, the simplifying assumptions made in the 19th and early 20th centuries are plainly wrong. They fail to account for the variety of cellular and genomic events we now know have occurred. The evidence points to rapid, non-random, non-Darwinian change. So that's kind of an interesting critique by a guy that's not a Christian as well. So he's been working on a new model, saying the old model is outdated, and he's looking for a new synthesis. And he's not one, he's just one of others. They realize some of these arguments that you've been learning in colleges for decades, and some of the things they've been saying over and over need to be up. They're just out of date, and the information has come in, more evidence has come in, and so they're going to have to rethink how they present evolution, to the scientific community, and of course how they teach it. Now, not everyone's going to agree with them because people hold on to paradigms, no doubt about it. But the point is, these guys are giving some pretty strong criticisms. And then you had Thomas Nagel's book that came out over the last 20 years. He teaches philosophy at New York University. I think it's New York University, Columbia, one of those schools. Another atheist. But he wrote this book called Mind and Cosmos, why the materialist neo-Darwinian conception of nature is almost certainly false. In his book, he says Darwinism cannot explain the existence of consciousness and higher order animals. Then it is even more incapable of providing a naturalistic explanation for the cognitive abilities of human beings. Why does mathematics work, and how is that human brain was supposedly evolved simply so that their owners would gather food and reproduce, are able to comprehend math? Evolution via natural selection does not and cannot supply an answer. Nagel agrees with Christian philosophers such as Alvin Plantinga when they argue that Darwinism cannot supply sufficient reason to have confidence in rationality. That beliefs are simply states of the brain, and natural selection chooses such states according to their contribution to survival rather than truth. There is no reason to trust our cognitive faculties. So another criticism as well. Now, like I said, when we look in the world around us, you can either say some of these things we observe, these design arguments, you either say there's an intelligent mind behind it, or else you say there's no mind, no intelligence, no creator, an undirected natural process can account for everything. And that's where the debate is. One of the arguments in design that's come out the last 30, 40 years ago that really started in physics journals, it's not a religious argument, it's in physics. They realize the universe is really analogous to a biosphere. Its basic structure must be precisely set up for life to exist. And they found out, some of the evidence came in that our universe is precisely set up for life to exist on Earth. It's a what we call a fine-tuned universe, okay? And there's been a slew of books that have been written on this, talking about this. They go in greater detail in all these books. So the universe itself, when we talk about fine-tuning, what we mean is that the constants and qualities and formulas or laws of nature that came into existence at the beginning of the universe. The universe came into existence. These constants of nature were set up a certain way. The way the electromagnetic force, the strong nuclear force, the weak nuclear force, the cosmological constant. There's all kinds of things, these quantities that had to be set up a certain way for life to get going on Earth. And they must fall in an extraordinary narrow range to sustain life on Earth. And so you don't get an Earth that gets life going unless you have the right universe set up. Okay, the universe has to be tweaked a certain way. And it hasn't been hugely controversial. I mean, many non-Christians accept the universe is fine-tuned for life. Physicists, that believe that yes, the universe is, looks like it's certainly on a razor's edge, and it has been fine-tuned, okay, for life to exist on Earth. It's clear. They just don't always agree with what the explanation for it is. Some of these guys are still atheists or skeptics or agnostics or deists, and they won't necessarily say, yes, God did it. God's behind the fine-tuning, but some of them don't even debate whether the universe is fine-tuned. So remember that before you even get to talk about biological evolution, which what you learn in college is when you start taking a class in biology, you start learning about biological evolution, but you don't even get to biological evolution until you have a universe that's precisely set up for life. You have a planet that is precisely set up so life can get going, so you can get first life going. And then you'd have to show how life came from non-life. If you're going to say that inorganic matter somehow gave life, gave new life from non-life, you're going to have to explain how that happened. We're still debating in the scientific community, they haven't really solved the problem of the origin of life. They're still trying to figure it out. I mean, we know how it began because of God, but I'm talking to the scientific community. They still don't know how they call it, how life got going. I mean, the first life, how that got going. You need that to get going before you get to anything else. So that's still being debated. And so it's kind of like this guy says here, this quantum physicist, he says, if we nudge, going back to the fine tuning argument, he says, if we nudge one of these constants just a few percent in one direction, stars burn out within 1,000,000 years of their formation. There is no time for evolution. If we nudge it a few percent the other direction, there's no elements heavier than helium form, no carbon, no life, not even chemistry, no complexity at all. And by the way, I think I heard a presentation that I think from Frank Turek, that there's more stars. If you added up, and he took all the grains of sand on all the beaches in the world and added those all up, I forget what the numbers are. That's still not enough. That you try to compare those numbers to how many stars there are. There's still more stars than all the grains of sand on all those beaches. Think about grains, how small they are. They have shown there's more stars than even that. So that's pretty interesting. Yeah, Freeman Dyson, another guy, talked about the fine-tuning argument. He says, the more I examine the universe and the details of its architecture, the more evidence I find the universe in some sense must have known we were coming. Okay, I don't think he was a Christian either. So why would we need a fine-tuned universe set up for life? Because, as I said, we need a planet that's set up for life. And that means that there must be some sort of intelligent agent that wants sentient, self-aware, reasoning, personal creatures to exist, and that's us, and that's God, right? So, and by the way, when you hear on the news, oh, they found another Earth-like planet, that's not true. They have not found another Earth-like planet. And when you say it's Earth-like, there's a lot of things to show it's really Earth-like, just like Earth. Okay, that's why you need to get that book, Rare Earth, Why Complex Life is Uncommon in the Universe. You need to ask yourself, why is the universe why can we comprehend the universe? Why is the intelligibility of the universe, the human mind, why is it intelligible? Why is nature ordered in such a way that it can be understood? Why is the universe not completely chaotic? Why is it we can do scientific discoveries? Why is the universe set up a certain way that scientists can do their discoveries? They can actually do physics and they can do cosmology and do astronomy. We must, for science to be possible, there has to be order in nature and it must be discoverable by the human mind. But why is that? We just take it for granted. We take it for granted, that scientists can do their formulas and do their experiments, and we can keep doing science and keep doing science, and the nature is not totally chaotic, that the natural world is not totally chaotic, and the universe isn't totally in chaos, and we can do these things. There's an order to it that allows us to do what we do. Okay. And sometimes we take that for granted. Now, when you're talking about intelligent design or design arguments, it doesn't really specify the God of the Bible as a designer. It can be. I mean, I think it is, but it's, they get criticized sometimes because they'll say, well, you're not really presenting the God of the Bible. You're just talking about like an intelligence or a designing God. And in response to that, intelligent design arguments are only one step. It's like the first step. Okay. So the goal of them are not to the goal of it is not to get someone all the way to the gospel with these arguments. It's a first step if you're talking to an agnostic or an atheist, as I said. Then you tell them, well, listen, there's some arguments for God in the world of design, but you know what? You know how God revealed himself in a greater way? He revealed himself through history in the person of the Messiah. So you just take them through this first step, and that gets them to the second step in history, right? So also intelligent design is not a God of the gaps argument. Sometimes people say, well, what happens is sometimes you guys thought the things in the world look like they were from God or some sort of God, and then we figured out really science could explain them. Like we used to say lightning was caused by the gods. You know, the ancients used to say lightning was caused by the gods, and then we just found out lightning's just a naturalistic thing that happens in the world around us. It doesn't need, we don't need to attribute God to it. But really, intelligent design arguments are based on not on what we don't know, it's what we do know. It's what we do know through the using a process that was actually used by a guy close to Darwin. It's where when you observe causes in the present, you know they're going to be same as causes in the past. So when you observe certain things in the present, we always know the cause of them is intelligence. Okay, whether it be 2024 or 1990 or 1940 or 1800, 1700, keep going back and back. It's always going to be the same when you observe certain effects. We know they're always caused by intelligence. Okay, so it's not an appeal to ignorance. Okay, now, as I said, you know, you could be a deist and believe in design arguments, right? That's someone that believes that God set up the universe a certain way with its initial condition, laws of nature, and then after that he's kind of hands off. But that's not, yeah, you design arguments could do that, but that's not the ultimate goal. We want to take people further into history then, right? And talk about who Jesus is. So it's not hard to get around deism. You just say, well, if you believe God created, did that, why wouldn't he want to reveal himself somewhere else? Why wouldn't he want to reveal more of himself and show what he's like? Why would he just stop after he creates or after the universe gets going, right? That's kind of begging the question why God wouldn't want to show more of himself. Now, when you look at a couple of things here, we think about some of the effects we observe, the intelligent effects that we observe, you'd have to ask yourself whether these can be caused by a random, thoughtless cause. Like there's no mind behind it, no intelligence. If you look at no intelligence, if you look at the reproductive system itself, you know, think about that. I mean, is it really easy to believe that a thoughtless, no mind, a thoughtless mutation brought into existence the entire reproductive system? I mean, you guys know the complexity of the reproductive system. It just so happened that through chance and time, we eventually evolved into a man and a woman, and the reproductive system just was part of that. And nature just knew somehow, some way to form a man like that and form a woman like that. And the whole reproductive system just came to be out of nowhere, out of chance and time. It's hard to believe that the thoughtless mutation would cause that, right? And then you think of like the human eye. You know, the eye is comprised of several parts. Look at all these different parts. You'd have to say a thoughtless act developed one of these parts and made it compatible to put it in an intelligent location to work with the other parts. A no mind, it just happened that, you know, the one little part came into place and it's compatible with all these other parts to make your eye work. You know, I mean, that's a tough one. Or just look at your eye. I mean, look at this stuff there. I mean, to think of look at the complexity of the whole thing that has to be in place for you to even have functioning eyes. And some eyes might not work well, but you see what I mean. So some of the design arguments in biology have always been the origin of life, like I talked about studying how life got going, the origin of the genetic code, as we'll talk about in a minute, the origin of new proteins, as we'll talk about, the origin of irreducible and specified complexity. And there's some issues with the fossil record and the waiting problem, the waiting time. So if you look at humans and chimps, I don't know if you've seen a diagram of this, the different things between us and chimps. Of course, we have significantly different shoulders, rib cages, spines, pelvises, hips, legs, arms, hands, feet, everything here. And in order for us to, evolve, to go through that process, of course, we live on the ground, walk and run, but what changes would really be necessary, to convert an ape-like creature to a human-like one? Well, you'd have to have a new design of the spine. You'd have to have a new shape and tilt to pelvis. You'd have to have legs that angle in from the hips. You'd have to have knees and feet and toes designed for upright walking. You'd have to have a skull that sits on the top of the spine in balanced position. You'd have to have a shift in jaws and muscle attachments. You'd have to have your face flat, or faces would need to be flat, and sinuses behind the face, and the eye sockets located in different places that permit a forward gaze. So there's a lot of changes that have to take place for us to, get from a chimp to a man. Now, sometimes, they'll say it's random mutation, just over time, mutations, that'll happen. Of course, all these new features, in the article in Nature in 2004, Bramble and Lieberman count 16 anatomical changes necessary to convert to an ape, from a human to an ape. And all these new features require multiple mutations. So the question becomes, is there enough time to get these changes by a neo-Darwinian process? And some people just say time. They always say time. Time's their answer. Give it time. Give it time. Time. Well, in any of these differences would require more than two mutations, but providing an advantage, it's very unlikely to have evolved in humans since our split with apes some 6 to 8 million years ago. But look at this right here. So this is a book written by, called Ancestors here. Look at this book, what they say here. This is two mathematicians calculating the ability for a single mutation to happen. They say, these guys are not Christians, by the way, but they say we simply could not have evolved in the time scientists assigned to our split from chimps about 6 million years ago. Many coordinated changes are required to turn an ape into human. Harris acknowledges with complex features like skeletal traits, we expect there to be many DNA changes responsible for them. And we would expect that these DNA changes would not have occurred only in a single gene, but in numerous different genes. Mathematicians Durrett and Schmidt calculated to get to a single mutation in such a regulatory site would take 6 million years, as much time as we've got to evolve from apes to us. Even if every gene evolves simultaneously, all those mutations need to work together to create helpful traits. Since mutations are blind to benefit, mostly harmful, and typically work against each other, simply isn't enough time for it to happen. So even if we did find a way to show that there's some sort of similarity between apes and us, like you'll learn in every evolutionary textbook that we evolved from apes, you could always say it's a common designer. That's why there's similarity. Let's say, like, chimps have 94% similar DNA as us, whatever. So do other mammals, by the way, like horses and other things. But you could easily just say that that's the evidence of a common designer. Just like when you find a junkyard with different cars there, if you find 5 different cars that look similar to each other and they have some of the same design features, you could just say, yeah, same designer made these different cars. I mean, I'm saying if you had to say, we could just say we just came from the same designer. But the point is that there's problems with that entire model, as you can see, from the chimps to human scenario, the steps that would need to take place and everything about the time issue. So we just mentioned a couple other things. Skip that. Okay, so when Michael Behe wrote his book, Darwin's Black Box, the one I talked about before, he talked about this thing called irreducible complexity. And he said that if it's composed of 2 or more necessary, this he's talking about something that's composed of two or more necessary parts. If you move one part, the function is impaired, not just impaired, it's destroyed. And so what he did in his book, talked about this book, Darwin's Black Box here, by the way. And so what he did is he gave this analogy of a mousetrap. So he said that, when you take a mousetrap, it has these five parts, a catch, a spring, a hammer, a holding bar, and a foundation. And, if you take away one of these parts, obviously the thing's not going to work. I mean, if you just take away one of these parts. And he kind of used this analogy with evolution, with natural selection. And he said that, an everyday example of an irreducibly complex system is the humble mousetrap. He says it consists of a flat wooden platform or base, a metal hammer, which crushes the mouse, a spring that extends to a power of the hammer, a catch that releases a spring, and a metal bar that connects to the catch and holds the hammer back. You can't catch a mouse with just a platform, then add a spring and catch a few more mice, and add a holding bar and catch a few more. All the pieces have to be in place before you catch any mice. And he's right. I remember my mom used mouse traps in our house growing up. I remember her going down and finding the trap caught the mouse, and I'd hear this yell from the basement, we caught one. And then sometimes it'd be really yucky, and she'd be like, ew, bring me a garbage bag down here. So the mousetrap, as you know, all the pieces have to be there at once. You can't just take away a part, right, and expect for it to work. And so basically what he said that when we look at protein machines that run the cells, there's a point at which no parts can be removed and still have a functioning machine. He called these machines irreducibly complex. So he was kind of using the mousetrap as an analogy, and basically he was saying that that even when you look at something like this, a bacterial flagellum, that if you even took away one of these parts, it would not work. This is in your body, by the way. You should go look at a video of this, how it works. It's like a machine. It's phenomenal. But you can't take away one of these parts through natural selection. Like, they all have to be there at once. So that was kind of like an argument he used in irreducible complexity. As I said, over 100 molecular motors are now known to exist inside the cell with very specific analogies to human design motors, right? So that was kind of like the argument he used to talk about irreducible complexity. Now, he got some pushback, as I said, and that's why he wrote that book called A Mousetrap for Darwin. Michael Behe answers his critics. You can get his most updated arguments, criticisms against it in that book right there. It came out a couple years ago. And then probably a more interesting argument, or something a little easier to understand, is probably the biological genetic code argument. And Stephen Meyer is a guy that's written a lot about this. You can get his books. But basically he talks about how DNA are the instructions or the blueprints for the human cell. That's like the boss. It's like the boss that tells your cells what to do. And you need a DNA that encodes, your DNA needs to be there to encode functional proteins, but it's more or less the instruction manual for your cell. Okay. Even Bill Gates, for all his shortcomings, as you know, he said that DNA is like a software program, only much more complex than anything we've devised. Richard Dawkins, the atheist guy I mentioned, he says the genetic code is truly digital, exactly the same sense as a computer code. And basically in your body, you have your DNA, of course, and these four letters, the A, T, C, G, the way they're set up, the sequence has to be just right to encode, for DNA to encode the information into digital form. And so that allows protein folding. And so, as Francis Crick said, any particular protein amino acids must be joined up in the right order. So you have to ask how nature just knows to, can nature cause that sequence to happen? Can nature put that sequence into order for protein folding, right? So it'd be kind of like, if you look at this diagram here, if you look at the far right where it says the genes contain instructions for making proteins, notice the instructions part, that's your DNA, the Instruction manual. Okay, if that's an instruction manual, instructions come from minds. Okay, instructions are not made by a natural law. Okay, and basically, you have to use the analogy. Think about like a guy that gives a blueprint to someone to build a house. Back in the old days, and they had physical blueprints. I used to get these, and I used to build houses before we had computers. And what they would do is you tell them what you want them to build. For you want to design, you say, I want to build this kind of house, and your architect would draw up the plan. He'd hand it to the builder, and the builder would then go build it with his subcontractors. But if you think about it, that architect, before he drew that house or that building on those plans, the information was in his mind. Okay. They were written instructions. He then made them into specific written instructions for the builder to use, but it went from the information into his mind to being written down in that blueprint and then given to the builder to build. Okay. Same thing with a computer programmer. When he does code, when he writes code, that information is in his mind first, right? And the instructions were written for the computer, but the information first originated in the mind of the programmer. So if you think about this, if you go back to your DNA, those instructions, that instruction manual that tells your cells what to do has information. The information has to be there for the instructions to work, for the DNA to work to build those cells. That means an instruction manual or instructions have to come from a mind because the information came from a mind before they even became instructions, right? See the analogy? Maybe not. So it goes like this. Instructions mean there had to be information first, and information comes from a mind or intelligence. Okay. And so that is something that has been talked a little bit in this book, Evolution 2.0. Basically, the guy wrote this book said I think he'd give like a huge financial reward to anybody that could figure out how your DNA, the information for your DNA came from a naturalistic law or how it originated without a mind. I think he was offering a reward if you could figure it out. So if DNA encodes information, it must have originated from a conscious mind because, as I said in an argument form, I'll just lay it out here. The sequence of base pairs in DNA is a code. All codes originate from a mind. Therefore, DNA originated from a mind. Kind of interesting. Okay. All right. Let me just mention a couple last things here quickly. So sometimes people bring up the issue with bad design. Let's say your body is not working well, and you've got physical issues. Many of us do. I understand. I'm sympathetic to that. I know people get cancer. There's all kinds of physical ailments. And, let's face it, the human body is not optimal, right? Maybe some of our bodies are optimal, but many of us have issues. And that's as we go through life and get older, we know that we have more issues. Or some of us have family members, or some of us been born with certain defects or certain things that don't look like they're intelligently designed, right? So bad design arguments are not really a scientific objection. That's more of a theological objection. It's more a pushback against the designer's intelligence. Okay, like he didn't do it right. If there is an intelligent designer behind my body or behind something in the world, it seems like he could have done it better, right? Seems like it would be different. Well, just an analogy. The Pontiac Aztec, 2001 Pontiac Aztec, which I never owned, was arguably one of the worst cars ever invented. And there's been other cars that have been really poorly invented, and we can all name cars that are better designed. But just because the 2000 Pontiac Aztec does not function as well as the 2016 Chevrolet Corvette, would we conclude that it's not designed? So we don't need to have maximum doesn't need to be maximally optimal to exhibit design. Okay, it doesn't have to perform perfectly to show that it was designed. And also, of course, we know the theological objection goes back to the fall of man. We know that sin has entered the world, and we know the world is off because of the fall. We know our bodies, we degenerate, we break down. We know the world is degenerating. We know that the fall of man has caused a lot of havoc. And we're part of that created order, and we're part of sickness and death. And our bodies were impacted by that, no doubt about it. Now, I don't have time to go into why God allowed the fall and everything. I've talked about that before, but the point is that we know that theologically the fall of man has certainly made a way so our bodies don't operate optimally, right? And so even whatever evidence there is of design, certainly it's not it doesn't look like it's perfect design sometimes because our bodies don't work well and other things don't work perfectly, but it doesn't mean it's not design. Okay. And as you know, just to kind of follow up there, similar point, same thing I was saying, if God is a perfect designer, why are some things designed so poorly? As he said, the fall has caused a lot of those problems. And we know that all design requires trade-offs. Laptop computers must strike a balance between size, weight, and performance. Larger cars may be more safe and more comfortable, but they also more difficult to maneuver and consume more fuel. So designing things requires trade-offs at times. Okay, so I think that's about it. I'm going to go ahead and stop there. Talked about quite a bit.